Okay, believe it or not, we almost made it to the end of the semester, but then Miss Petrella finally got a cold. It's kind of amazing we lasted this long, but sorry about my, voice and nose and all that stuff. Add to the situation, my neighbor today has decided to get a tree cut down out there. And so if you hear a lot of like chainsaws and power tools going on, sorry about that. It's all just a matter of strange timing. So, anyway, Chapter 29, Triumph of the Right. Well, wait a minute, Petrella, back up for a second. The right? I mean, seriously, since basically the last month, all we've been talking a lot about is the power of the Democrat Party and how the left has generally controlled the government dating back to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I mean, yeah, you had that little window of Eisenhower in the 50s, and while Nixon had his presidency at the turn of the 60s and 70s, really, we spent most of our time talking about the influence of the left within that time frame. So what happened here? Well, what happened was the crisis of confidence that we looked at back in chapter 28. The American people had tried liberalism and really under Jimmy Carter had gotten this sense that it had failed them, that here they were in an economic crisis, not getting respect from foreign powers, a government that wasn't respected by its own people, and Americans grew tired of that. And this is nothing new. In case you missed it, throughout our class, we've seen this thing where if the country progresses toward economic, political, social reform, that there'll be a backlash. This sense of is what we called it in the 1920s, a return to normalcy. And we see that in 1980, that the American people are looking for that kind of sense of pride and respect and stability that conservatism brings them. And that really comes in the face of a guy by the name of Ronald Reagan. One thing that cannot be denied, no matter how you feel about politics, is the charisma of Ronald Reagan and how he's able to reunite the American people behind conservatism. And he really focuses a lot of his attention back on that Cold War, something that we saw in the 1970s through détente, as you might remember from the slideshow, really start to ease the tensions. That really was back in spades. Add to this whole situation was this idea of using economic conservatism to expand the economy. That includes major tax cuts to create more reinvestment. And we're going to see in the slideshow and in the supplementary materials that this has a lot of interesting and different effects on America. And of course, it was only 40, 50 years ago. It's still really hotly debated today, the effect and impact this had on the development of the United States. The one thing we know for sure is that, one, it changed the way economics work, that we see more borrowing being used by the United States government and by the American people. And that drives a lot of our economic growth. And that's going to be a pattern we see for bad or good, depending on your political beliefs, moving forward. Okay, the other thing that there's no doubt about is the Cold War, as we know it, finally comes to an end. By the presidency of George Herbert Walker Bush in the late 80s and early 90s, a lot of the groundwork that had been being laid going all the way back to Truman finally becomes a reality, and communism in the Soviet Union collapses, thus leaving the United States as the lone superpower in the world. And this really shakes up the Americans' mentality because for years, like literally 50 years, this had all been about a competition between us and the Soviet Union. Now, suddenly, we had to redefine our role as kind of this one existing superpower and understand what that role would be moving forward. And it really sets up this incredible roller coaster that it's included your lifetime in Chapter 30 of what the United States wants to be moving forward. The other thing that happens is, by the time we get to George Herbert Walker Bush, what we're seeing is the ideas of economic conservatism have not necessarily panned out as well as the Republicans had hoped. As a result, to maintain their party and their conservative ideals, they really start to shift towards social conservatism and embracing the Christian right, okay? And this is going to be a major factor in developing what you know as the Republican Party today. So, what do we got left to do in Chapter 29? Well, don't forget to watch the slideshow. Okay, there's a video on this shifting American foreign policy and how it's really defined by the Gulf War of 1991, and that will really kind of set the stage moving forward. There's a reflection exercise looking at how this massive economic upswing during the 1980s affects African Americans. This group who we've been looking at so much with civil rights movement in the 1960s, and then seeing how economic opportunities are lagging behind going into the 70s and 80s, and we're going to look at how that affects them moving forward into the 90s. And then this idea, you have a supplemental exercise of kind of considering how pop culture plays a role in politics and the way Americans feel about themselves, focusing specifically on something that happens right at the beginning of the chapter, the miracle on ice at the 1980 Winter Olympics. So make sure you take care of all that stuff. We've only got a couple weeks left, and we will see you next time.